This morning we come to the final message in our sermon series and the perspectives on John. It's been an interesting series, I think. Some of you have said that you really enjoyed it. It's challenged you. Some of you have said that it's been difficult and confusing at times. And others have said that, they just didn't get anything out of it. If we're playing baseball, that means I'm batting at least 300. That's not bad. But as of this week, we're coming to the end of this series, and I hope if you get the chance, you'll go back and look at it. We've got all of the messages online. You can read them or listen to them online, and so I encourage you to do that. But this morning, as we come into this, I want to ask a question. When is a thing not a thing? When is a thing not a thing? Well, in the cabinet to the right and above the stove are 4 ball mason jars, 2 wide-mouthed, 2 regular, each quart-sized. They are what you would commonly think of if you thought of a mason jar, transparent glass with the word mason imprinted on the bottom and the word cur in script above it. Normally, my wife and I drink water out of them, trying to stay hydrated the best we can by making sure we get about 2 jars a day. Occasionally, they get used for craft projects for the children or as flower vases if we happen to bring in some wildflowers. And yet, the mason jar is more than a simple drinking jar. It is a series of memories and cultural affectations, born of a lifetime of experiences. It's drinking sweet tea in the backyard of a particularly humid evening at the parsonage in Thomaston. It's seeing my Aunt Louise's cellar at Possum Trot on the Berry College campus filled with summer vegetables to be eaten at family dinners in the fall and winter. It's an afternoon of painting random things on typing paper with my children, or the centerpiece to a table set for neighbors at seminary in Kentucky. It's a drinking jar, and yet it's much more than that. It's a reminder of home and the things that make home, home. It's a connection to something deep, meaningful, a sense of belonging that comes with a combination of memory and experience. That drinking jar is a sign, a significant marker of an emotional bond existing beyond time and space of its birth. Now, each of us could probably think of something we see in similar fashion. The truth is, they could be anything, from a physical object to a certain smell or certain feeling that you have. All of these things can be signs that bind us to people, places, and moments in time. When we read biblical literature, we find text filled with allusions to signs, things which are representative of something else other than themselves. I say signs rather than symbols because signs are part of a system. And this series of signs are put together, send out direct and meaningful communication in what's known as a code. It's like developing a language, using not only words and thoughts, but gestures and movements, and it's all done for a particular circumstance, a particular understanding of things. For instance, let's say you went to a college football game. How would we know that a particular person was a fan of a particular team? Well, the stadium would be filled with colors, those of the home team and those of the visiting team. So let's say the home team is red and the visitors are blue. A man wearing a red shirt is standing just outside, watching people walk into the stadium. Now, is the red shirt a definitive giveaway that he's on the home team? Not necessarily. He could just like red and be standing out there to see what all the commotion is about. But what if he had a red hat to go with that? Well, it's still not enough to say for sure that the man is interested in the home team. Now, what if I told you it was Saturday afternoon and you were in Athens, Georgia, outside Sanford Stadium, and you were crying? Almost there, but not quite. One final crucial touch, one more sign is necessary to make this code complete. And that sign is the letter G on the hat and on the shirt. The G on the shirt would be a definitive sign, make the code complete, or at least close enough for us to reasonably assume so. And we would assume this is a Georgia fan. And again, also with the crying. All of these signs, the red shirt, the hat, the location, the crowd, point in the direction of a certain thing, but it requires that one more crucial sign, the G, to let you know with some certainty that the man is a fan of the home team. Now, when all those signs come together, we call that a code, a language for that circumstance. In this case, the language is made up of clothing a certain color, a location that has a certain specific purpose, a certain day of the week, and an insignia on the clothing. This is the language of college football, and any fan in the South would recognize with just a few of those signs the language of the code being spoken, or at least would have had a good idea. Now, John chapter 21 is actually an addendum, like the first part of chapter 1 in John. Most scholars believe that it was added later, after the basic manuscript was finished. Our job is to look at the signs and see what the code is that they point to find out why it might have been added and for what purpose. Kind of like being spiritual code breakers. We're going to attempt to look back at all of these signs that are in this chapter and try to understand the message that was being conveyed by these people writing this in the first century. The first thing that we come to is this idea of fishing. Peter, as several other of the disciples, was a fisherman. As our story begins in chapter 21, Peter goes back to doing what he's always done, what he knew how to do, to fish. Given that Peter could not handle the boat or the nets alone, he enlisted the help of his fellow disciples. The disciples go fishing, and they find nothing all night for their troubles. Not a solitary fish for the effort. The next morning, exhausted physically from the work and mentally from all the things that have gone on in their lives recently, they head into shore. Waiting there on the shore as they head in is a man they do not recognize who refers to them as children and asks if they've caught anything. They say no, and the stranger tells them to throw the net on the other side of the boat. And when they do, they find so many fish, they can't even haul the net in. Peter recognizes that this is Jesus. Something in his spirit, something in his being is able to connect. And he sees Jesus on the shore. Impetuously, he jumps into the water, swims to shore while the others bring the boat and the net in. Once ashore, they find Jesus sitting at a fire, waiting with bread, which he gives them to go with the fish. Very common meal, reminiscent of John 6, 1 through 15, where Jesus fed the 5,000. The writer of the addendum notes that Jesus has now appeared 3 times to the group since his death. Fishing, according to one theologian, might represent bringing to light those things in your subconsciousness that you've not really wanted to deal with. Eating also has subconscious overtones. In this case, to begin to assimilate or accept things that you've not previously wanted to accept. In the disciples' case, it's possible that they're having to deal concretely with the death and the resurrection of their master and friend. And so, we might look at this fishing episode as a sign to point to their acceptance of Jesus' death and his resurrection. Now, the second part takes place after breakfast, as Jesus asks a very pointed question to Peter. Simon, son of John, do you love me? This question plays on 2 things. Peter's tendency to react quickly or impetuously, and Peter's internal desire to set himself above the other disciples. We see this throughout the Gospel of John. as Peter is often the first one in the group to speak up, speak out, speak too often. The words used for love are different in the question and the answer. Jesus says, "Do you agape me?" Peter says, "I phileo you." Now there's an important distinction to be made in these two words that get translated into English as the word love. Basically, what's going on here is they're saying two different things. We'll get into that in just a moment. Mixed in with that is Jesus' admonition to take care of the other followers. Feed my lambs. Take care of my sheep. Feed my sheep. This repetition is similar to a repetition of Peter's denial in John 18 and points Peter back to a time when he said, "I would give up my life for you." Now, agape is best understood in light of the meal that the disciples share with Jesus, a meal representative of the Eucharist or the love feast in the early church. The idea is the idea of love of man for God and God for man. It is akin to the idea of a complete, unreserved feeling of affection for another. The word phileo, on the other hand, is a lesser expression. It has to do with feelings of fondness or to treat someone with kindness. Phileo is a surface expression of affinity for something, where agape goes to the bone, a deep, intense connection. So the second sign here seems to be that Peter's going to be tasked with the responsibility for the sheep of Jesus' flock, and he'll be expected to love Jesus, or love as Jesus loved, and most likely die as Jesus died. After their discussion, we come to the third sign, and Peter looks and sees the disciple Jesus loved, whom many presume to be John, the son of Zebedee, and asks, "What about him?" In other words, Peter is saying, "You're giving me all this stuff to do, but what's he going to be up to?" It reminds me of my kids doing chores. When one of them is doing something and the other one is doing something they regard as easier. Why do they get to do that? Why can't I do that? Within the passage, the Greek language gets technical. Suffice it to say, the point is about whether the beloved disciple will remain alive until Jesus returns, as is mentioned in Mark 9:1. Jesus makes it clear that this is irrelevant in the grander scheme of things, saying to Peter, it doesn't matter what he does. You know what you have to do. Ultimately, the point, I believe, that is being made here is the same point I make to my children. You each have things to do, now go do them. Jesus is saying that each disciple will be tasked with something according to the direction that the Spirit of God gives them. As a sign, we might regard this as a commissioning of sorts, with each disciple having a God-given responsibility in the years to come. Now, if we were putting all these things together, all of these signs together in something called a code, a collection of signs pointing to a singular idea or expression of something, I think it might look something like this. The disciples, having faced their grief over Jesus' death and shock over his resurrection, are now being given individual tasks to live into going forward. The code for this might be that this future assemblies of followers will also have to come to grips with the death and resurrection of Jesus as they who follow the followers and followers' followers learn how to live into the life that God calls them through the work of Jesus. So, as we continue on with the messy church, what do you think? What do you think about these signs and these codes? Now, here's the thing about signs and codes. What I see in them may not be what you see in them. And that's okay. Because just as God spoke to me through what I've read here, God speaks to you through what you hear there.